Good morning. Thanks for joining us for the continuation of the NHLA Diversity Series. I'm Nalandra Anselmo.
And Michael Testagrossa.
So let's tell you a little bit about us. I have about 25 years in human resources, and that experience has been primarily in the hospitality industry. I now focus on consulting and coaching with an emphasis on personal development and strengthening relationships. And what do you do, Michael?
And I have 30 years of hospitality experience in hotels, restaurants, and university dining. And then I also have 15 years of hospitality education.
Let's go ahead and take a look at what we will cover today in our topic 7 tips for creating a more inclusive workplace.
Okay. So we're going to start out by just revisiting the definition of what is inclusion, and then our 7 tips, starting at the top: assemble your crew, encourage real talk, question everything, start small and think big, be strategic, and then celebrate diversity. And at the end, we'll have a little bit of time if you have any questions.
So if you joined us last time, we really focused on the why. Why a focus on diversity and inclusion within your organization is important. And today we're really going to look at the how. So before we get started, we have a couple of polling questions that we will pose to you today, and we'll put our first one up now. And this one, we won't show the results. This really is just for us so we can get an understanding of our audience. And our question is, let's go ahead. How many of you are in leadership positions where you can impact your diversity and inclusion programs? So if you can mark yes or no, whether you are in a leadership position where you can make decisions and impact your diversity and inclusion programs within your organization. Wonderful. Thanks. Okay, so most of you, yes, are in that position. Great. So let's go ahead and get started here. So when we talk about creating an inclusive workplace, what do we actually mean? We'll go ahead and revisit our definition of inclusion: the extent to which each person in an organization feels welcome, respected, supported, valued, and where they can contribute their best efforts. And so what this really means is, what it has to do is creating an environment where people feel it's a place they want to be, where they feel accepted, where they feel like they can show up whole and focus their energy on doing good work versus having to check a part of themselves at the door, having to navigate a culture that doesn't feel accepting of them. And so, for example, if you had an inclusive work culture, let's say that you provided lots of different ways for employees to contribute their ideas. So a lot of companies are into brainstorming sessions where you have to come up with ideas on the spot. But what we forget is that some people are introverted information processors and require time and space to think and come up with those creative ideas. So if I have an inclusive environment, I'm providing lots of different ways for people to contribute their best work. So note that I didn't say anything about race or gender or ethnicity or religion or any of those things, those primary dimensions of diversity. This is where you leverage all parts of diversity and where you go from a one-dimensional view of diversity to a two-dimensional. And that is even the aspects that are acquired traits and not just inherent traits. Most important though, when we talk about an inclusive workplace, we want to understand that it's not just HR driven. So if everybody in HR took the day off, would your diversity and inclusion practices still be observed? Would the behavior remain the same?
So I always like to start off with a little bit of statistics because I think this helps to put in perspective and a lot of times provides buy-in. So a survey of 1,500 people conducted by the Boston Consulting Group found that while a majority of companies have a diversity program in place, as shown here with 96 to 98%, only about 25% of those demonstrated a benefit for the employees. So basically, these companies only reach the first step of the process with diversity representation, or are focusing on the wrong things since employees did not find benefit. So when we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, it isn't just enough to have the program for the sake of having it. And this tells us that there's almost 75% of companies that have opportunities to expand the focus on inclusion. So our conversation this morning is to offer some suggestions on how to bridge that gap by designing programs that offer value and expanding the focus to the next steps of inclusion and equity.
And here are our 7 tips, starting with number 1, start at the top.
So in our first program last week, we discussed many of the D&I programs falter because of lack of buy-in from the top leaders. The key decision makers, who oftentimes tend to be white men, 45 years and older, who underestimate the barriers that are faced by our diverse populations. And their underestimation is about 10 to 15%. So if we're only tracking diversity in hiring and have a D&I department, then we've missed a lot of opportunities. So our first step in bridging the gap and focusing on inclusion is starting at the top. Referring back to the gap in diversity programs and offering value for diverse populations is a lack of buy-in and understanding by leadership of the importance of inclusion and where to focus these programs. One of the best ways to get buy-in from leaders is focusing on the ROI and benefits from implementing these. Emphasizing the business case for diversity, which we detailed last week, includes innovation, retention, social collateral, and reaching new markets. These are all relevant and significant outcomes that would entice leadership to engage. Basically, it's all good for business, morale, and profits. And of course, profits are the things that will definitely pique their interest. There's also the aversion factor. By having a great program, you're also decreasing liability from diversity missteps. So at times it may be good to start with an ally in leadership to help champion the cause, particularly in smaller organizations that may not have a diversity officer. This could be a senior manager. But part of building the case and outlining the support is also through training. We can't always expect leadership to innately understand or know all of the intricacies of these conversations. Depending upon organizational structure in which positions are represented, a savvy HR team, a chief learning officer, or a D&I division can assist with support and training programs. As with other organizational initiatives, all those levels of leadership need to be trained, starting with the top leaders and then train the trainer programs working down the organizational chart. Once trained, the organizations need to practice inclusive leadership, either by including diverse voices on the leadership team or having leaders who are able to articulate the needs of a diverse workforce. And what we do as leaders, are we embracing the culture of D&I? So just as we hold employees accountable for certain standards and expectations of customer service, we also need to hold leaders accountable. This can be accomplished by employee surveys, evaluations, or even tied into their incentive programs. So organizations need to have checks and balances to make sure that everyone from the top down is engaged for this to be successful. And finally, and what ties this all together is the D&I needs the support of the organizational culture. So it's really important that this is kind of the day-to-day, the very core of the business. Leadership has a key role here as well, because they need to embrace this and then actively support it. Especially by giving it life and putting it into action. The key step in this is really that this needs to be more than platitudes and superficial words. It needs to be an authentic acknowledgement of the needs and then again, displayed by our leaders.
And so number 2 is assemble your crew. Now you've got that exec buy-in from the top of your organization. So once you've secured the commitment, you also need the actual support. When you have those execs who say, yes, I'm in, now assign them roles, real visible roles in your organization Make them heads of committees. When communication goes out, make sure that your top execs' voices are among those heard when there are discussions about diversity, inclusion, and equity within your organization. You start with execs, but you don't want to forget your managers, your supervisors, those line supervisors within your organization, the ones who communicate with your employees every single day. These are the ones who are going to be pivotal. They're critical in not only moving information from the top down, but bringing information from the bottom up. And so you don't want to leave them out of this process as you begin your initiatives and your programs within your organization. Also, find people who don't necessarily have titles within your organization. These are employee influencers. These are the popular folks. These are the people that your employees listen to. Really, organizations run like networks. They operate just like networks, social networks. And so just like social media has influencers, your workplace has influencers as well. So you'll want to identify those people as you're putting your team together. Create subcommittees. Make sure that people are, that small groups are responsible for specific tasks. You might have one group that works on legislative issues. You might have another group that works on coordinating events, another group that works on gathering feedback from the workforce. Maybe one group will look at policies and procedures within your organization. And don't forget to include your learning and development department. So they are already used to bringing people together. They're used to evaluating learning within your organization. So they already kind of have the infrastructure in place for educating your workforce. So make sure they are involved. And a lot of times L&D, they are the first department that an employee sees when they join your organization. And then don't forget your external resources. If your resources seem slim within your organization, don't be afraid to look outside of your company. Look for partners in the community. Look for people that you already have relationships with within your company and capitalize on those relationships. And don't forget that you can also look for outside consultants to fill in the gaps, especially if you do not have a person dedicated full-time to diversity, inclusion, and equity. But however you do it, you want to make sure that you have as many employees involved as possible, and that means you're going to have to go out and sometimes look for those people.
But here's the key of what not to do. So a recent article in the New York Times noticed a trend in companies scrambling to fill their diversity committees with basically anybody on their team that represented people of color, regardless of their interest in being a representative. This is really just a form of tokenism and is counterproductive. Just because somebody fits into a category of diversity does not mean they're the ideal candidate or want to have these types of conversations.
Right, so you have to be able to allow space to invite a person onto your team of diversity leaders within your organization, and also give them the space to decline. And they may have many different reasons why they don't want to be the face of diversity within your organization. Number 3, encourage real talk.
So our kind of underlining component before we can have a real conversation focuses on authenticity. So this is kind of one of the current catchphrases that we hear quite often more recently in the past few years. But the theory of authentic leadership has been around since the 1960s. And there's renewed interest now in linking to transparency. So both of these concepts are relevant when we begin to have conversations related to diversity and inclusion. So why is it difficult to have these real conversations? So we have the teams in place now, and we're ready to engage. The hurdle here is that these conversations do require authenticity. For the diversity, inclusion, and equity programs to be successful, teams need to have, they need to leave behind preconceived notions and biases. This is moving from the lower levels of defensiveness and anxiety to curiosity and understanding. This is opportunity for candid conversations, and it needs to come from a place without judgment. And you can't just walk up to a person of color or a representative of other segments of diversity and expect them to have candid conversations. I used to participate in presentations in the university settings discussing topics of diversity, and it requires some ground rules, as well as an authentic approach from those engaged in the conversation. There is a perceived risk as well in talking about opinions and beliefs, delving into differences, biases, and possibly traumatic experiences. Often those who are not within a diversity group don't always understand the perspectives and the struggles. I've been lucky to have some friends from diverse backgrounds who felt comfortable to share their experiences with me. They talked about what it meant to be Asian, Black, Latin, gay, or a woman. Some of their experiences that they shared weren't unexpected, while others, I was really shocked to learn that they had encountered these things. Like sometimes we really think like we're very progressive, and oftentimes we're not. Like we have so much further to go. My friends took a risk in sharing that I may not understand or believe what they experienced. And at times, again, I didn't really want to believe it, but I think it was a great opportunity to learn. And I was grateful that they were open enough to talk to me about that. But organic conversations like these don't normally happen, especially in the workplace. So just as not everyone wants to be a diversity representative, not everybody wants to share their stories, and not everybody has the same stories. So we need to be careful in our assumptions of what we expect. The last point is probably the biggest hurdle, the fear factor. Leaders may be a bit apprehensive to start these conversations because of what they may learn by digging deeper into their organizations and really operate on a daily basis. And if they find the systems in place are flawed or lacking, well, then how do they respond? But fear is also a two-way street. So employees also have some valid fears in sharing their experiences, especially when they're not secure in their positions in the workplace. Often our voices of diversity don't want to share their opinions or experiences because it could impact their career goals or their ability for advancement. So starting out with this quote, so women, professionals of color, and LGBTQ employees often feel they have to scrub themselves of ethnic, religious, racial, socioeconomic, and educational identifiers that make them who they really are.
So we were having a conversation about this, and we thought of some examples for Black women, especially. A lot of times, and we're hearing more about this lately, but a lot of times you will hear a Black woman in a professional setting say that they need to maybe hold back or adjust their language so that they don't come off as, like the angry Black woman at work. And sometimes it's something that we laugh about, but it actually is a consideration. We also want to think about this idea of code switching. There are employees from many different groups and cultures who, when they show up at the workplace, feel that they have to adjust the way that they communicate, the words that they use, sometimes the tone. And a lot of these things really can be quite exhausting. And so what you want to do is make sure that you understand that this really is a thing in the workplace.
And furthermore, so women of color are more likely than white women to feel that they must compromise their authenticity if they want to be leaders. Research reveals that 72% of Black women, 53% of Latinas, and 52% of Asian women say that executive presence at their company is defined as conforming to traditional white male standards. In contrast, only 44% of white women said the same. From the feedback I've received from coworkers and employees, as well as my own personal experiences, this is definitely an accurate assessment of the perception and reality in many organizations. So what do we do? How do we figure out kind of the next step? And that's discussing the methods to collect feedback. So we need to really go beyond our basics of the suggestion box and embrace some newer methods to reach our employees to get their opinions. There's a variety of options available, but organizational culture needs to support these. through both tools and resources. All these methods that we're going to talk about need to have leadership support and reinforcement, along with easily accessible options to access things such as a computer kiosk or computer stations at work near like their EDR or their department. Employee surveys can be great tools, but they're only administered once a year. And a lot of employees don't feel that their voices are being heard, so they may not be forthcoming on information. For those of you familiar with surveys, they also need to be worded and administered to be without bias. Some organizations have a required percentage of completion, and they really push their employees to take these. I remember taking one employee survey quite a few years ago, and at the beginning of it, and this is before we had the computerized ones, it was all check boxes. The HR person said to everyone, okay, before you start your surveys, don't check the middle box. Don't check neutral, because that doesn't help us. And I was just like taken aback that she actually started it by telling us what to do and how to fill them out, because that basically swayed the survey. So we really need to be cognizant of how we word these and also how we administer them. So a better option than the annual surveys is to do pulse surveys. These are designed for more of a regular pulse checks to solicit feedback. These are shorter surveys with just a few questions focusing on certain areas or opportunities for change. And these are more regular. They give us a better idea of the day-to-day in a certain period of time. But as with annual surveys, for employees to participate, there needs to be results. This also promotes the concepts of inclusion and equity by giving employees a voice in the workplace. There's some other great options as well. For instance, we have skip level meetings, which offer an opportunity to provide feedback to an immediate work leader's director or manager. There's also the leadership hosted roundtable meetings, such as lunch with the GM, with representatives from a variety of departments to represent their concerns. And again, here we need to make sure that we have the voices of diversity represented. But again, it could be a little difficult to have these conversations, especially with higher level leadership, because again, there's that fear of risk and even reprisal. So better options that may provide anonymity are company-sponsored websites collecting feedback, or outsourced sites like Glassdoor or other review sites where they allow employees to provide their input without that perceived risk. This can also provide insight into the pervasive issues in a department, especially if there's multiple reports. Exit interviews often capture information too late. So some companies have implemented what they call stay interviews. These are designed to see what makes employees stay or would decide to leave. Questions linked to the inclusion measure that the organization is doing things right or could do better. These could include things like, how do you like to be recognized? What talents are not being used in your current roles, or what motivates you? So we're going to take another quick poll and just checking in to see if your organization utilizes any of these types of surveys for feedback.
Yeah, and the idea is if you all, and just mark any and all that apply to you. The idea is that if you already have the structure in place in your organization and you're collecting information about other things, it would be very easy for you to add a collection of information regarding diversity and inclusion. So mark any and all of these, and this will just give you kind of a head start on having these conversations within your organization. We will go ahead and take a look at the results of this one together. We'd like to see what everyone's doing. Nice. So most of us are using roundtables and collecting online feedback. That's wonderful.
So it looks like we have some opportunities. So nobody has heard about the pulse surveys. I know that is something that takes a little bit more of effort and somebody dedicated to basically put those together and collect the data. Yeah, looks like only about 30% of people said annual surveys. And then stay interviews, we have 15%, so that's great. So good information. It looks like at least Organizations are trying to solicit feedback in a few different options. So when we do start to ask questions, we find out a lot about our populations. So a 2019 survey, the same one I mentioned earlier, 16,500 employees from 14 countries revealed quite a few common goals with three populations of diversity: women, people of color, and the LGBTQ employees. All three of these groups shared 7 of the top 10 concerns. Those included anti-discrimination policies, cultural competency training, visible role models in leadership, blind screening, bias-free day-to-day, employee surveys, and bias-free evaluations and promotion. So by these responses, it's evident that we still have a lot of opportunity here for improvement. I thought also interesting in this survey, they also asked the white men who took this to see what their top concerns were. So the number 1 and number 2 for them was anti-discrimination policies and cultural competency training. So I think that's promising. It tells us that our organizations are slowly realizing that we do need to make change. But again, we have a little bit of way to go. Conversely, their bottom rankings were visible roles in leadership and bias-free day-to-day. So obviously, there is quite a discrepancy in how people are treated. And the only way to discover this information is for your organization to ask. If you get it right and you get this data and are able to build on it, then you can definitely help improve your diversity and inclusion, which translates into better retention and also better options for recruitment. So our last slide in this topic is employee resource groups, also known as affinity groups. And these are great resources for providing diverse voices a place to find representation and community. Participation in these programs continues to increase as demonstrated by these findings of the Diversity Inc. survey. In 2011, the top 10 companies with high diversity scores had 29% participation in ERGs, and the top 50 at 23%. And only 6 years later, it jumped up to 38% and then 36%. So if your company does have employee resource groups, this is a good option. But it's also, they have to be effective. So part of the benefit of having a resource group is also maneuvering through the onboarding process and again, providing a voice, particularly like in the first 60 to 90 days when employees are going through that kind of the struggle of understanding culture and how to do their job. This offers guidance and support. And 90% of companies have shown that ERGs are a great option to help with this. The second part of the statistics is also relevant as it builds a core to the group and creates social collateral and appeal to target markets in the same population. So for instance, if you want to appeal to the LGBTQ market, having an employee resource group that supports this community is a great opportunity. There's also a variety of requirements for this to be successful, from creating goals and objectives to having an executive sponsor for each of the groups. As with other programs in an organization, tracking the effectiveness of these programs compared to their goals is required. Probably some of the most important issues or areas of success for these are linked to recruiting, enhancing leadership development, and creating a culture of inclusivity. But as we said, as with other programs, the only way for these to be successful and have positive outcomes is continued support and evolution. In preparing for this presentation today, I polled a few colleagues at different of the casinos on the Strip, and many of them had kind of different opinions. One had mentioned they had ERGs that were participated in the onboarding process, but the company discontinued that years ago. Another person who had been with their hotel for 10 years wasn't even aware if the hotel had ERGs. So again, so much opportunity for development.
So number 4 is question everything. And we mean everything. So organizations, just like people, will go through developmental phases. And so once, as awareness increases, you'll start to take a look at things around you and start to try and understand them in a different way or look at them through a different lens. And so some organizations really are going to have to be willing to go from not paying much attention to the status quo to really being open to looking for areas where changes can be made to really disrupt the status quo. The first thing you might want to do is review your current policies and practices. Are they relevant for today's increasingly diverse workforce and environment? Or are your decisions really driven by past practices? Are you doing things because we just kind of always do them this way? For example, you might consider looking at grooming and appearance standards. This is kind of like low-hanging fruit, in my opinion. A lot of organizations are just taking a second look at what's going on with grooming and appearance. Do you have policies that prohibit, natural hairstyles, dreadlocks, braids, curly hair? When you do that, really what it looks like is a policy that is not inclusive, but really is exclusionary. What you're doing for maybe a large group of your employees is creating an environment where they feel like they have to spend extra time and energy, wake up earlier in the morning, to get their hair as straight as possible so that it can look as close to your average white employee as possible. Another one is your policies on tattoos. And you might say, well, what do tattoos have to do with diversity? Let me throw this one out there. Your younger population, millennials, about 40% of them have visible tattoos, period. So if you have a policy against visible tattoos, what you may be doing is pushing away that demographic that could be the next source of your talent within your organization. There was an airline, Air New Zealand, they recently ditched their no tattoos policy and just said, as long as the tattoos are not offensive, feel free to wear them. And we think of the airline industry, those companies usually are pretty conservative when it comes to appearance. And so, interesting. Now, here in this town, I think lots of organizations have figured it out, but not all of them. And so these are things that you really want to take a look at. What does successful mean within your organization? How do you define success? Does it mean conforming to what you think the majority cultural leaders want, or what they think, or what they do, or what their appearance is? So we tend to value sameness in the workplace. And so we might have to get out of the idea of valuing sameness. And we'll talk a little bit more about this next week when we look at bias in the workplace. So what you may also want to do is think about the idea that diverse teams, really it takes them a little bit longer to integrate their talents and to be successful and to achieve that cohesion. So what that means is you might have a little more failure in the beginning phases of putting together, of assembling a diverse team. And so encourage failure, celebrate it. There are lots of organizations, Google being one of them, that really makes a big deal when a team takes a risk, goes out and puts an idea out there, and then it doesn't work. They say, well, you know what, it's great that you even took the risk and tried. So that means you're encouraging innovation as well. Lots of companies have failure parties with champagne and everything. Instead of a hall of fame, they have a hall of failures. And so what you really are doing is kind of changing the culture to one where you're not, restricting or prohibiting people to express themselves in ways that before in your organization haven't been done. It could be that you're looking at your recruitment processes. And I'll take this one way far back. The Philharmonic orchestras across the country. Back in the 70s, this groundbreaking decision was made to start doing blind auditions. In the audition hall, they put a screen up, and anybody who auditioned for the Philharmonic would have to audition behind that screen. And they also carpeted the floor. And why would they carpet the floor? So that they couldn't hear the click, click of high heels come in and then automatically know that a woman was auditioning. Just that one little change in the recruitment practice resulted in from 25% to up to 46% a higher chance of women being hired or selected for those orchestras. So you may have to really think about things that you want to change. In your employee life cycle, we talked about this one before. This is a model that I think is a really good tool for just kind of checking in so that you can really get a visual of all of the policies, procedures, practices, and the programs within your organization that you will want to take a look at. It's not just your recruitment practices. It can be your onboarding. Are new hires exposed to a variety of, people in your organization who look like them? And Michael talked about employee resource groups, but this really can be a way to create diversity and inclusion efforts within your onboarding processes. In learning and development, if you have mentorship programs, are you allowing mentors and mentees to self-select? Meaning you're allowing your managers to say, this is the person that I want to work with. Because a lot of times we said we value sameness. You're going to end up with a mentor and a mentee who maybe share a lot of those primary dimensions of diversity or even secondary dimensions, but we're not looking at matching up a mentee with someone who might be able to help with those conduits of information. We know that information flows in conduits in organizations where some people always hear about the openings and the opportunities for promotion, and other people never hear about them. So what you want to do is kind of cross that up. In your performance management, what are you rewarding and what are you punishing? Are you punishing someone for making a mistake when it comes to diversity and inclusion, asking a question or making a decision in that learning mode? And so what you want to do is make sure that it is okay to make mistakes. And when there is a lack of awareness in diversity and inclusion, making that a learning opportunity instead of a punishable moment. Reward and recognition. Are you recognizing managers for assembling and managing diverse teams? Are they getting rewarded for that? Is that what's being touted in your organization? And even when I talk about rewards, what about your benefits? Are you broadening your definition of family when you include what benefits to offer your employees? So this is what it looks like to incorporate this in every part of what you do, even offboarding. When someone leaves your organization and you're doing an exit interview, what you don't want to do is just assume that somebody left because of a lack of their ability or because of their traits or characteristics. Ask hard questions in your exit interviews. Did a person feel welcome? Did they feel accepted? Did they feel like they could contribute their best work and show up whole to work? These are the things that you want to be looking at. Okay, number 5, start small, think big. When we talk about starting small and thinking big, here's the thing. When you have a diversity and inclusion program or initiative within your organization, a lot of times initiatives fail because it takes a lot to kind of get them going, and then we don't do a lot on the back end to follow through with things. So what you want to do is create momentum very early on. You want to do small things that are going to make a difference. Take immediate action so people aren't waiting around. You know, you said this thing was coming, but we haven't seen anything. So you don't have to, for example, change your entire recruitment policy because that's going to take a while. That's going to take a lot of woman hours and man hours to do that. But what you can do personally is go to a different place that you normally wouldn't, where you normally wouldn't source applicants, and hand out your business card and say, hey, would you like to come and see about applying within our organization? If your organization or if your culture allows it, create informal focus groups before the formal ones come. And that way you're getting started. change your language. You can do that very easily. You don't have to change an entire handbook. You can start changing language within your memos and postings and on your intranet so people know, hey, things are changing and it looks a little bit different around here. Something that you can do personally is just change your, use your pronouns tag in your email. That's something that you can walk out of here today and do to show people within your organization that you're looking to move that needle as far as diversity and inclusion is concerned. So start small and then build future templates. You can grow into this stuff. You don't have to do it all overnight. Number 6 is be strategic. Now, we've talked about your mission, your vision, your values in your organization. Your company's strategy is a little bit different though. Your strategy is like your current playbook. It's what your organization has identified that you're doing, maybe short term and maybe longer term, to remain competitive. And it decides, for example, what your hiring practices are going to be, how you're going to allocate resources. So if your organization, for example, has a strategy of improving guest service scores, or attracting a certain age demographic, an older demographic or a younger demographic, or if it is to improve the performance of a particular product or service, or sustainability. You know, different organizations have different strategic goals that they have in place currently. Make sure to tie those into your diversity and inclusion goals. Make sure they match. So it'd be easy to do, for example, if one of your company's strategic goals is to increase supplier diversity. That, you know, is kind of baked into diversity inclusion, is kind of baked into that one. But there are other ways. If you're looking for demographic, then look at those employer resource groups and help them to help you reach your strategic goals. And always use the metrics. Use a scorecard, use a dashboard. And it used to be that we had diversity scorecards and it was just about those primary dimensions and representative numbers. How many women do we have? How many people of color do we have in our organization? But go from that quantitative to qualitative and find out about people's experiences and figure out what the metrics are and what the indicators are of success within your organization. You can measure things like engagement. You can measure things like employee development, who's being promoted and to what positions. These are the things that you want to add so that you can link them directly to your business strategies. Use your technology. Lots of these things you already have in place, but you need to make sure that you make diversity and inclusion a part of the infrastructure of your organization, just like IT, just like security, just like marketing. These are things that permeate through every part of your organization. Your diversity and inclusion efforts need to do that as well. And no strategic plan would be complete without a SWOT. Everybody's seeing strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You want to make sure that you are looking at each of these from a diversity and inclusion perspective through that lens. What are your strengths? Is it that you have lots of upper management support? What are your weaknesses? Is it that you don't have great recruitment practices, or that your processes are not up to speed, or that your policy handbook is outdated? What are the opportunities? Where are those untapped markets? Where do you have undeveloped talent that you haven't been paying lots of attention to because your internal processes haven't allowed you to do that? Look at partnerships outside of your organization. Are those opportunities? And then of course the threats. Are there legal problems? Are there morale problems? So you want to make sure that you understand those as well from a diversity inclusion standpoint, even financial obstacles, so that you can attack them accordingly. And our number 7 is celebrate diversity.
So if we've successfully maneuvered through the first 6 steps, then we can move on to our last step, which is celebrating diversity. And there's 2 levels here. The first is the internal aspects of celebrating the successes of our employees. as well as celebrating the diversity of our community and our employees as a whole. The first step in recognizing personal achievements and creating formal recognition programs. So we need to understand what the preferred methods of recognition are for diverse work groups because they may vary slightly. Some may prefer more public praise and others want it to be more private recognition. And with recognition, it needs to be personal achievements of all the staff. So if we only praise front desk managers or the front desk team and the sales team for their accomplishments, then we're leaving out a huge part of our organizations. And oftentimes these parts are the areas where there's a lot more diversity. So we need to make sure this is inclusive.
Yeah, and when you're publicizing, not just within your organization, but outside the organization as well. I recently was on a flight on United Airlines, and I had an option of what in-flight show or movie I wanted to watch. And they had listed in their shows a channel dedicated to celebrating diversity and inclusion, the efforts of their team members. And so I, for, I don't know, 45 minutes, maybe even an hour, sat and looked at, leadership contributions to diversity and inclusion. I looked at the employee resource groups and what they were doing. I looked at the awards that employees were earning for their efforts in diversity and inclusion. It was quite a nice little change of pace, but it's not just inside, but outside your organization as well. Don't be afraid to do that.
Yeah, this is definitely a great example of creating that social awareness and social collateral for the organizational culture and the recognition of staff. The second step of celebrating diversity is through general awareness and education. Some companies do a great job with internal marketing or buzz sessions, for instance, to mention Black History Month or International Women's Day. For instance, one property that I was at for International Women's Day, they would collect all the women executives and have photos together. And that's where it ended. So we don't want to just post about awareness months and celebrations. We really want to educate the staff as to the relevance. And again, the more we start to have these conversations, the easier it is to continue these conversations. And this is all about creating that inclusive environment and focus on the education. Maybe you have table tents in the EDR during Black History Month about key contributors or even staff members. The more, again, that we talk about it, the more relevant it becomes and the more in the forefront for everybody to be engaged. It's also important to recognize other significant holidays. So for instance, Columbus Day just passed, but did you know it was also Leif Erikson Day on Friday? And that was also Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday. So important to be encompassing of not just kind of what the popular culture, other holidays you want to be aware of and share with your staff. Juneteenth, Yom Kippur, Ramadan, National Coming Out Day, Mexican Independence Day, and other relevant cultural celebrations. Again, the more we start talking about it, the more we showcase that we're invested in diversity and inclusion, the more it's going to continue to grow. And when an organization celebrates the cultures, it really demonstrates that engagement and inclusion. So our last poll is, does your organization do a good job of promoting diversity?
Of celebrating diversity.
Sorry, celebrating.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, celebrating and promoting diversity.
And promoting diversity. Yes. A yes or no or a not sure. And we'll go ahead and take a look at those results as well. We'd love to see those. Maybe we got a lot of undecideds on. Maybe we haven't decided yet how to respond. And we'll go ahead and close it up.
Oh,
wonderful. 71% of us are part of organizations that do a good job of celebrating. Well, we are the hospitality industry. I imagine we know how to celebrate.
Great.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for helping us on that one. So just as a recap, we need to start at the top. We need to get our leadership to engage and support our diversity and inclusion programs. With assembling the crew, we need to make sure that to solicit participation from key influencers and those interested in being a part of the conversation, and to make sure that we have sponsorship from leadership. We also want to encourage real talk and candid conversations in a safe space for all voices of diversity to help shape the programs and engage and support them. Question everything, literally everything. Review the processes, the employee life cycle, and verbiage to make sure it's representative. Start small and think big. Small gestures can make a big difference. The key is to get started, even if it starts with just a personal level. And once you have analyzed and considered your organizational goals, create a strategy to begin becoming more competitive and focus on the objectives of D&I. And then finally, know how to recognize the contributions of our diverse workforce, as well as to be able to be representative of diversity of all populations.
And now we are going to open it up for our Q&A, and then we will wrap it up after this. So this would be the time for you to use either the Q&A function. You might even be able to use the chat function here, but we prefer the Q&A. And we'll give you a moment to type any questions you have, and we will do our best to answer those questions for you. And while we are typing, I think Anthony's going to help us with this, but while we are typing our questions, maybe we can go ahead and take a look at what is next. So next in our series, we have Unmasking Unconscious Bias. That will be a good one, folks. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. And then of course we have other topics that that Michael and I have been engaged in just recently. So we have diversity in action, marketing to diverse target markets, cultural intelligence and inclusion policies for diverse clients, all further areas of exploration. I think we have some questions here, so let's see what we've got. Can you give an example of an ERG? How does that affect the structure of the organization? So I don't know, Michael, do you want to take it or do you want?
Sure. So at Caesars, we had a couple different organizations. It really just depends upon how you want to structure it. So for instance, we had one that was focused on the LGBT community. So that was kind of team building. They had networking events and then also participated in local pride events. We also had Chorus, which was inclusion of people of color. So it's really just giving people in diverse populations a place to go, particularly when, for instance, you may be the only person of color in your department. And a lot of times you want your people. And having a resource of finding your people in your organization is a great way to build community and just provide those resources. So it's really, depending upon the size of your organization, if you're a small company, so like some of the smaller hotels that I worked at, we didn't have employee resource groups because there just wasn't a whole lot of staff, but that doesn't mean you can't have them. It's really just a matter of somebody championing the cause of putting this together. Other ones, for instance, it doesn't necessarily always have to be just topics of diversity. It could be like we had a Code Green one. So focusing on more of the eco option for the company or volunteer opportunities to give back to the community.
And you want to understand that, there are going to have to be some guidelines here. So for example, make all groups open to anyone. Right. You want to make sure that anybody can join any group. You also want to make sure that you give appropriate space and time for all of your resource groups. And that way you can, avoid some of the reasons that organizations shied away from resource groups or affinity groups in the recent past, I think we're starting to address those issues and figure out ways to leverage the power of those groups to help with the organization's success. Let's see if we have any other questions. No, we don't have any open questions. Thank you for that one. Thank you for that question. We appreciate it. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, let's go ahead and move on. We want to make sure you have an opportunity to complete our survey, our post-session evaluation. We really do appreciate you taking your time to complete that. So you can, if you have your cell phone handy, you can go ahead and capture that. And it'll take you right to our survey where you can submit your answers. It's very short, but we really do appreciate your input on those.
And then if you have any other questions, our contact information is there on our website for info@diversity-inclusion-equity.com.
So thank you so much for joining us. We have had a blast today, and we're looking forward hopefully to seeing you next week.